Is there going to be a war with Iran? This side says yes, there is. This side says no, there isn't. How's it going to go? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. Hey, like, comment, and subscribe. Sign up for my free newsletter and links to the guests in the description below. Hey, good morning, Joaquin. Thank you so much for making yourself available.
How's it going? Good morning.
Tuesday, the 24th of February, and it seems like the war drums for war with Iran are getting louder and louder and louder. What, 2 aircraft carriers in the Gulf, and then a third moving over into that region. What's happening, Joaquin?
Yes, intriguing indeed. What to do? What does the Trump administration want to do with Iran? Right? Like, I think to approach the question, you would want to ask, like, what is their end game? Right? And once you have a sense of the end game, you can make better general forecasts. And certainly, what I think needs to be appreciated is when, in this most recent round of, let's say, American threats on Iran, one of the interesting things that came out was the Iranians responded that they would respond in kind and attack American bases in the region. This, would refer typically to, let's say, American bases in Iraq, Qatar, and so on. And then they updated that threat and they said, actually, we will also unload on Israel. And the reason that they had originally said that they would focus on American targets is they wanted the United States to understand that they would directly respond on the United States. And then there seemed to have been kind of a rethinking of their promise to respond and retaliate, because any moves against Iran under this administration are being driven to appease Israel. So there's no midterm or long-term strategic geopolitical advantage to regime change in Iran. There's very little connection between U.S. interests in the region and regime change in Iran. And one of the things that people should keep in mind is that there is no foundation operationally for a regime change in Iran, if that makes sense. In other words, you would need an alternative power structure. We don't have that. We don't have people that are ready to assume power and control in Iran that are capable, that are in the know, that have the competencies. And no one believes that the pretender to the non-existent throne of Iran is a serious man. No one believes that he's capable. He has not dedicated his life to a serious pursuit of, anything. He's a socialite, but he's not a serious person who has spent time cultivating relationships in the intelligence sphere with Iranians in Iran. So what we can understand is that if there were to be some sort of Western or US war or attack or major destabilization effort on Iran, with the aim and with enough behind it to create havoc, to create a crisis in leadership, this would result in the scenario in which this has the effect of immobilizing the state in Iran today. Rich, this would have the effect of creating a failed state. And this is completely unacceptable to Russia. Now, unfortunately, in the realm of, I guess, political chatter, people speak in ethical and moral terms. And of course, we can talk about the human toll and calamities of, associated with war. But this is about the understanding on the Russian part that they will not tolerate a failed state on their southern flank. And they are already involved in a conflict in Ukraine. They, in that sense, have one of their hands tied down. Russia is capable of waging another Ukraine-like conflict in another or adjacent region, but that would be pushing it. And certainly it's not in their interest, and certainly given the state of rapprochement between the US and Russia, it would seem strange to do something like this. So what I wanted to say is that if there was a viable, actual alternative state structure that had been fostered by Western intelligence agencies with genuine contacts and people in Iran, then you might see a scenario where the Russians might be able to live with or tolerate a regime change, because that would just be regime change and not destabilization. So what you don't want is destabilization and this kind of growing black hole. And I think that is what you saw with the Russian intervention in Syria a decade ago. And anyhow, also we should bear in mind that there is a Russian nuclear project in Iran. And as far as the Iranians are concerned, like right now, they believe that they're preparing for the next round of talks with the Americans and that progress has been made and that it's on the table whether the Americans, now I don't like to use this language of like will allow, because that's just the language of the paradigm that we're in. I don't believe, personally, ethically, morally, that the United States should be speaking in terms of we will allow such and such country over here. Yes. So
That's okay. I'm just wondering, you said earlier about the US doing this in order to appease Israel. Now, is
yes.
that Trump or is it the neocons? Because I keep hearing from other guests on my channel like Tom Luongo and Alex Craner, whom both of us have a lot of regard for, that Trump and Netanyahu don't get on, that Trump is not out to create the Greater Israel Project, in which case, why would he be attacking Iran in order to appease Israel?
Again, that's the $64,000 question. I'm of the opinion that Trump and Netanyahu have very different agendas. And Netanyahu is the product of a bygone era. And in that bygone era, it was acceptable and it was part of the strategies used by Western intelligence and military planners to create failed states and regions of instability on their own border so that they could exploit those and manage power in their region in that way. Maybe we'll get to talk about Mexico, and there's a similar thing happening here. So what we're seeing with the Trump administration is something of a corrective course and trying to pull away from this Israeli plan, so to speak. But I think it's important to recognize that when we're talking about countries like Israel that are considered, part of in the nomenclature and in the Western culture, like part of the international community, kind of like part of the West, if you will, and are normally included when you talk about, the A5 plus I or Five Eyes. They're normally included. You talk about, the CIA, the MI6, the Australian Special Secret Services. You're talking about the Mossad, etc. This is all, and there's a long-standing relationship between the 5 English-speaking countries and Israel in particular. And a lot of people, of course, tie this back to the British themselves, in particular the City of London, financial. But I think it also, the role of the United States and the CIA, independently, quasi-independently, can get swallowed up in some of that discourse. but it's certainly uh, not in the idea, or any moves to destabilize Iran are not within Trump's preferred courses, and he's resisting this. But the influence from within the United States is significant. We do have a very significant Zionist lobby in the United States, so it's and but what we're seeing, I think, in terms of the patterns of how Trump does things, in these patterns, he tends to do things that very much look like he's gearing up to do one thing, and then at the last minute, he pulls the rabbit out of the hat. And I mean, I just in this past year alone, it's been quite a wild ride, and he's done this 4, 5, or 6 times. So we're just kind of, is he going to do it this time or not? And um, again, the last time there was you had obviously an issue with Trump claiming that he destroyed Iran's nuclear facilities. Mm-hmm. And in numerous talks that he's given, or brief interview clips saying, well, Iran this, and it's like, well, I don't know why we would destroy something that we've already destroyed. And so what we understand is that the Israelis know that the US did not destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. And there's a reason for that, and that is very interesting, but that is what ended the 12-day war. And I think what this really for people to understand is that it was Netanyahu that was pushing for that ceasefire. It was Israel that tapped out of the 12-day war, not Iran. Iran was prepared to keep going. Iran is well equipped with numerous, we're talking hundreds, thousands of hypersonic missiles that already immobilized Israel's so-called Iron Dome. Any revisionist approach to the history of everything we just saw, this is not 10 years ago or 20 years ago. This is literally last summer. This is just 6 months ago. So I don't know what planet some people are living on, but one thing that we can say for sure is that it was only 5 or 6 years ago that former CIA Director Mike Pompeo said that Iran possesses the ability to eliminate Israel thousands of times over with its hypersonic missile arsenal. So thousands of times over means that they can do it many, many, many times over. I don't know, these are the assessments at the top of Trump's his 45th administration. What we saw in 12 days was very little compared to what Iran still presently has. And they've restored and rebuilt, whereas Israel hasn't even rebuilt the damages to the stock exchange, the diamond exchange, and other places in Haifa and Tel Aviv from last summer. Why isn't media focusing on these, twin tower crater type? There's like 5 of them. They had like 5 twin towers in terms of the craters and the damages to Israeli infrastructure. Why is this not being talked about anywhere? So this is something that the Iranians have changed their messaging approach to be clear that if the United States attacks us, we will flatten Israel. Right? I mean, Iran's not in the position to strike New York or Los Angeles or Chicago, right? Or military installations inside the United States, but in the region, of course. But that would only draw the United States further into a conflict. So I think Iran is understanding very clearly the relationship between the American public, Trump's position, midterm elections, the US-Israel relationship, and how people see it. So this is a super interesting development. And is it possible that the US will strike something in Iran? Well, sure, it's possible. But that wouldn't mean an all-out war, and it wouldn't mean regime change. And I'll just conclude with this point, is that the Zionists are frustrated with the course of developments in Iran. There are many things that Trump will green light or approve, which will satiate or keep those neocons and others from having a clear foundation to register a complaint. Otherwise, we see this all in the media. We saw this with Venezuela. We saw this with Elliot Abrams. We saw this with Mike Pompeo. We saw this with John Bolton. They all complained about the fact that Netanyahu's girl, Machado, was not being installed in Venezuela. Mm-hmm. Likewise, with the so-called protests in Iran some months ago, right? These were supposed to be lined up so that when the United States, let's say, does an aerial campaign, simultaneously you have the protests. Okay, by having the protests start back when they did, the timing is all off. Timing is everything, Rich. So they've expended their assets and their capacity to be able to do anything. I mean, just assume right now the United States were to start bombing Iran. Let's set aside the fact that that's a war crime, by the way. Unprovoked, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Politically destructive for Trump, by the way. But let's just assume that. Well, the corollary where you're going to have, thousands of people in the streets and you're going to have chaos and mayhem, right? That's now out of the equation. So what's the fucking strategy? So anyway, this is the way to think about this. Now, do I have a crystal ball? No. Right? But this is the way to think about these things.
Yep. And with regards to you don't have a crystal ball, or at least you say you don't, but I have found your analysis to be rather sharp and accurate and insightful.
I appreciate it.
Which is why I learn so much from you and enjoy having you on my channel. Okay, so here's what I know as a fully unqualified, inexperienced, no knowledge whatsoever military analyst. Iran is not Iraq, and right. Iran is not Libya. Iran is like population of over 90,000. It has an industrial base. It has oil. Compare that with Israel, 8 million people,
right.
Riven by all sorts of division, no major industrial base, right. Little in the way of hydrocarbons, no natural resources.
Yes.
Just its big brother, the United States, the neocons and the Zionists in the United States to side with. And then Iran does have two rather big friends in the form of Russia and China. And it's been preparing for this. It's been absolutely preparing for this. And then on the other side, there's Trump, who lies. He just lies. But Obama lies. Obama says, yes, we're going to have peace and I'll pull the troops out and end wars. And then Obama starts up loads of wars and kills hundreds and thousands of people.
That's right.
And Trump lies the other way.
That's right.
I'm going to bomb everybody and kill everyone and you'll be sorry. And then he does short half-hour attacks that kills very few people.
Right,
if
anyone at all. Right. Yeah. It's a very people are used to politicians lying. They're not used to they haven't figured out yet that they can lie in any number of directions. And it's the thing is that identifying a lie does not mean that you were lied to. Identifying a lie that's out there does not mean that the intention was to deceive you, right? So you are not the target of this deception. So this is not like an ethical issue affecting people. Trump is lying to other elites. Trump is lying to Netanyahu. Trump is lying to neocons, or he's goosing them along. He's playing games with the media. He's deflecting. He's creating messaging simulacra that indemnifies him from criticism from the neocons.
Right.
So he goes through a lot of these motions, and then, like we said, he pulls the rabbit out of the hat at the end. And I think that's what people have to understand. And like you were saying about this disequilibrium in between Israel and Iran, and like you said, Iran has 90 million people. They have hydrocarbons. They have all these things. It's not Iraq, and Iraq was degraded over a long period of time. almost immediately. I mean, you had the Iranian Revolution in '79, then you had the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War within a year and a half. Then you had Iraq going from, they had what, like a 5-year gap between the end of that totally destructive for Iraq war, where they lost millions of soldiers, and they had their economy suffered because it was focused on the military track. They didn't make the territorial gains that they thought they would maintain, that they had made it at the start of the conflict. Then they turned their attention on Kuwait, and they were lied to by the Bush administration, who said, "Yeah, go in there, get your $5 billion back in stolen, diagonally drilled oil resources from the Kuwaitis." Then Bush uses that as the pretext to go in and start a conflict with Iraq, which degrades Iraq over the next period of years. Then they're under the sanctions regime. Then Clinton bombs them again. So by the time that you have the 2003 invasion, or 2002, thereabouts, after 9/11, this was already a state that had been degraded 20 years. 20 years by endless war and sanctions. So now some analysts out there might say, well, could be a similar approach being taken on Iran. In other words, like death by 1,000 paper cuts, or so to speak. But it's what I think, and again, your point is salient, because again, you're talking about Iraq does have a sizable population, but nothing like Iran's. And the issue for the Iraqis was that they had alienated themselves in their work through CENTCOM. Saddam Hussein had basically privileged the relationship with the West. And so while there was some triangulation with the Soviets and the West, like you would see with Tito in Yugoslavia, like you would see with some of these non-aligned movement countries, nevertheless, the Soviets in the 90s, they were in collapse, and you were having like Gorbachev is coming out, Yeltsin is coming in. This is like 91, 92, 93. The Russians were in no position to help anyone anywhere. They couldn't even help themselves. So this is quite distinct from, the parallels become astonishingly dwindled when we start to compare Iran and Iraq. So I would caution analysts out there who think that we can just copy paste the approach to Iraq onto Iran, setting aside intent, like setting aside what the long-term goal is. Even if you assume the same long-term or mid-term goal, this is apples and oranges. So,
Right.
yes.
Right. But the other point that I was going to go on to say is Trump doesn't do war like previous American presidents.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, in a way, he doesn't even do war. He does short kinetic actions, like with Venezuela, like with when he killed Soleimani, like with when he bombed the nuclear sites in June last year. And even with Yemen, did that for a few weeks and then signed a peace deal with them. And that was the end of that.
Yeah.
What's he going to do with Iran that isn't going to end? And I'm sure he's aware, because I think he's a very, very smart, astute player that isn't going to end up in a quagmire.
Right. There's going to be no ground invasion. There's going to be no troops. There's going to be no quagmire. There's going to be no sustained operation. I'm always looking at.
So I don't even think, because there were no ground troops in Libya, I don't even think he's going to do the destruction of Iran like was done to Libya, because that would be
that's
state.
the red line that we're talking about vis-a-vis the Russians, because Libya did result in a failed state. Libya is still in a state of civil war now, 15 years later, after the murder of Muammar Gaddafi, so by Hillary Clinton, right? We came, we saw, he died. And that was Obama's kinetic action. Like, that was Obama's in and out very quickly. But the point was to create a failed state, because you would actually need to do what the Bush administration had termed nation building, like in Iraq, which really resulted in the construction of this green zone, having agents and death squads in the area, and then a lot of cash, and then manipulating Shia, Sunni, and regional rivalries and tensions in Iraq, which still we see in the parliament today. And what has that resulted in? It has resulted in really an increased hegemonic presence of Iranian power in Iraq. So, this obviously is not, you could say it removed Iraq from being a threat to Israel, but it was also a threat to Iran, and there was just a lot of things going on. I don't want to get too much into the Iran-US relationship, but it may be interesting to people. I mean, it was at the time of the Iranian Revolution, there was a stronger likelihood that the Soviet-supported Tudeh Communist Party would come to power in Iran. A lot of the student protests and workers' trade union strikes and so forth that were immobilizing Iran and the capital Tehran at the time were from the left, from the Marxists, from the communists, and very similar criticism of, let's say, in the lingo of third world and anti-imperialist nationalist movements and communist movements, the Iranian the so-called Islamists, right? Those supporting Khomeini did use a lot of this left-wing discourse to intersect students and workers, and they also had, of course, like in historical religious centers like Qom, supporters of Khomeini who were integrating a lot of these social justice themes into ideas about an Islamic republic and developing a theocracy. And but it was clear that when you had Khomeini in France and so forth, and that he was then, there is so much there in terms of the Western support for Khomeini, for the Iranian revolution. In other words, it wasn't like they made a revolution because they really disliked the Shah. The issues with the Shah were complex and growing, and it looked very much like the Shah, the last one in power, had aligned very closely with Nixon. Mm-hmm. So when Nixon, in effect, was taken out, then you had this, and Nixon had a problem with Israel, and the Shah also was developing a problem with Israel. But this doesn't mean that the Iranian Revolution was to save Israel or that the Iranian Revolution was planned by the West, right? So people can kind of get their narratives or their threads all confused. In reality, the actual conditions in Iran were fomenting revolutionary activity in a rather organic way. And the preference of the French, the British, and the Americans for Khomeini was a preference versus the communists. So, in other words, look, there's going to be a revolution in Iran for sure. The question is, is now Iran going to fall within the Soviet, sphere of, satellite states and so forth, or can this be, triangulated into something else? Then immediately you had, the Iran hostage situation, which Reagan manipulated to come into power, and they made deals directly with Reagan. Like these guys in power in Iran now made deals with Reagan not to let the hostages go under Carter. So that became kind of an election thing that cost a few points, and Carter lost that election. Reagan won in a landslide. That wasn't the only issue of the day, but he won in a landslide. And then immediately you had with Oliver North and the funding and weapons pipeline using lots of things that we'll connect into Mexico later with Iran-Contra. The Iran-Contra scandal, Iran-Contra affair, and Iran's role in that. And then you had Iran's role in Clinton's war on Yugoslavia. You had Iran supporting and arming and training Mujahideen in Bosnia. So this is, the relationship between the West and this present Iranian government is complex and multi-layered. There is so much to untangle. Like I said, I don't want to go down that road because it is really, that's like a 4-hour discussion, or people can read on it. But I invite folks to dig in.
Well, I might try and tempt you down that road because I got a question brewing, which is, what about the role of the CIA and I suppose more so MI6 and Mossad and the French security services, whatever they're called? Because I do remember in 1979, Khomeini coming from Iran, from Paris, where he'd
Yes.
been in exile. And at the time, I was just a kid, didn't mean have any significance. By the way, my father's Shia, and he was really cheered by the Iranian Revolution. My mom's Sunni, and she wasn't. She was kind of neutral about it, right? But
Yeah.
what about the role of the CIA and Mossad and MI6? Because I've heard this notion out there that somehow this regime is connected to those agencies, and part of the whole British strategy of setting up this group of ants over here, supporting them a little, to keep fighting this other group of ants over here, in order to keep the region unstable, so you don't have the emergence of strong nation states that can look after their own.
Sure. Those are sometimes very much planned. The British do have a history and a role in planning things. The British are not omnipotent, omnipresent, and so forth, but they do have.
But they are omni-evil, right?
They are omni-evil, but they're also oftentimes omni-buffoons or omni-retarded. So there's, there's like Dr. Evil levels of stuff going on with the British often. A lot of the stuff with the British is stumbling into something, looking at the chaos, and then finding the angle that works for them. So it doesn't mean they've always created the situation, but these can be emergent phenomenon, which at different points could have been the result of their antics or the result of their meddling, but sometimes things go in a different direction and they still try to orient and figure out what's the angle there. So I would say, look, we can't ignore the fact that just 12 years prior, there had been a color revolution in France, right, to remove the de Gaullist structures. That was May of 1968, and the British were against the French. So, to the extent, whatever, we're talking about the French deep state here, we can't just talk about the French secret intelligence services, the Mossad, the MI6, the CIA, like they're one organization. They are not. There's intelligence sharing, there's coordination. You can talk about the A5, you can talk about NATO, you can talk about 400 years of, Western or European colonialism, imperialism, like those are conversations, but it would be an error to conflate that, that the interests of the French are the same as the interests of the British. Here's an interesting angle in the Iranian Revolution. Was this a move by the French against the British? Right. Insofar as the Shah was supported by the British, but the Shah had issues with the British as well. I mean, this was the issue with oil and whether Iran would be able to refine their own oil. I mean, the British basically owned the refineries which Iranian oil to get to Western markets had to go through. So in effect, they didn't really have the full value of their own resource. And the Shah was complaining about this quite a bit, and also complaining about the Western policy on Israel and things that they were getting away with. So again, it's so many layers. I don't want to confuse the pretender to the non-existent throne, the prince, Reza Pahlavi, for his father or grandfather, who again were maintained by the British. We're not the original, not the real dynasty of going back several hundred years in Iran. So this is not, again, they shouldn't be looked at with any kind of nostalgia or with like authenticity or credibility, but they were more competent. At least they were competent to a certain extent. Not at all this unfortunate, Beverly Hills guy running around today. So,
I'm quite impressed and stunned. I mean, by your knowledge of the intricacies of Iranian history, which is why I think it's so valuable that people go and join your Telegram channel, which is New Resistance. And I'll have the links in the description below. So then, how do you see this playing out? Will Trump bomb Iran? Won't he?
Yeah, maybe.
Where have you laid your bet? Maybe.
Yeah,
he might.
maybe.
He might not.
Like, look, if I was like on Polymarket and there was like odds for will he take military action? I think those are high enough. 60-70%. If I was going to give you a PFA, that means pulled from ass value. And then but regime change. Oh, I would say under 20%, under 15%.
So then what would be the point of kinetic action if it doesn't produce regime change? What's he out to accomplish?
Yeah, well, I suggested the last time I talked to Tom Luongo, whose work I can recommend on his podcast, Gold, Goats, and Guns. I said, look, there could be an agreement with the Iranians can make an agreement about Khamenei. You know, maybe Khamenei will. We were talking about, well, maybe Khamenei will leave power or something like this. But it's like he's pretty old, and in the scheme of things, there is going to be a new Ayatollah. You know, like what are the odds? Right back to odds that there's going to be a new Ayatollah in the next 3 years to 7 years. You get closer to 7 years, it's like almost certain just by age and stuff like that. So then what's the urgency? Like Netanyahu is the only person like on the planet right now that genuinely wants to destroy Iran. Even within the Israeli Zionist establishment, even among right-wing Zionists, they're separate from that view now. They understand that no, we need to integrate differently into this region. The old way doesn't work. The world has changed. We can't economically, it's not viable that you look at Israel's two main sources of imports, right? That's going to be China and the European Union. And for the European Union, a lot of that is derivative or made from Chinese stuff. And then you have like labor value added in Europe. And their supply chain economics is non-viable. Meanwhile, you've got they have a possibility to integrate through India, through EMEC or IMEC, but that's going to require, like we said, support from the Qataris and the Saudis, and that's going to require that the UN Security Resolution on Gaza is implemented, right? Which means Egyptian, etc., security forces representing the interests of the Palestinians, and the IDF moves out. So this is no longer for the IDF to keep this ongoing zone, or for Netanyahu to keep an ongoing zone of instability and an apartheid open air prison genocide or whatever happening there. So this is, again, Netanyahu is like one of the main issues, and it's not even in line with, you know, an enlightened view of Israel's national security interests. It's not even in line with what good for Israel. That's what's so stupid about this, Rich. So again, very unlikely regime change. The age of the Ayatollah also would seem to suggest that there's going to be someone else in a few years anyway. And again, I think, but I don't want to get caught in that. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with the Ayatollah in Iran in terms of, like, if you're Iranian, like, you have a right to have your problems. Like, don't get me wrong. But as a geopolitical analyst looking at international relations, international law, stability, those questions, Iran isn't doing anything really problematic, in my view, regionally, right? Yeah. They're a rational player that acts in their interests, and so because of that, those can be forecasted, projected, understood, and where problematic, contained by other regional players. But I just will finish on this: of the Saudis are now going in the direction of civilian nuclear energy, and they have repeatedly said that Iran also has that right. And Saudi Arabia and Qatar and a few others, Egypt and others, have said no attack on Iran. Even the Emiratis, who can vacillate a little bit, and by and large, when it comes to some of these inter-Arab conflicts, more recently, I think the Israelis favor the Emiratis in many ways. Even the Emiratis have said no attack on Iran. All these countries have said we will not allow the U.S. to use our airspace, bases, locations, etc., to launch attacks on Iran. That should tell you a lot about the direction of things, especially given that all those same countries are what Trump needs to make Gaza happen. So that's how it fits together.
Wow, that's just so many, I don't know, competing interests, plates to keep spinning, to keep an eye on. And what I find valuable, well, I did a video with Tom Luongo, I recorded it on Friday, just gone, and it was about Iran, and he was talking about that Trump's objective is to take out the IRG sites to weaken the Revolutionary Guards. And then I think last week I did a recording with Alex Craner, who gave his perspective on Iran. And what I find really valuable is I take what you say, take what Tom says, take what Alex says, take what a few others say, and then try and get a sort of thorough understanding of what might be going on. Because there's value from each of you, and also from Professor Vladimir Provkin, who I hope to have on soon. And thank you so much, Joaquin. I'll have the links in the description below. And this is why I suggest you subscribe to Joaquin's work on Telegram and also my work on YouTube and my other channels, so that you can get these sorts of insightful perspectives. This is Rich and Joaquin signing out. All the best. Bye-bye.